Join us today as we share videos from the vault, special presentations, past interviews, and share with you the A.R.E. through the ages.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Thurston. I'm very pleased to be with you this evening to share some ideas and some experiences around a topic that's been dear to my heart for decades. In my role as an educator studying the Edgar Cayce readings, transpersonal psychology, positive psychology, the topic of finding meaning in life or finding a mission in life is a subject that I've written about and led workshops about for many, many years. And I'm pleased this evening to have a chance to do this webinar with you. In these changing times in which more and more education is being done in this sort of virtual format, it's a nice challenge for me to see how we can take this material and put it into about an hour with a PowerPoint presentation. And then we'll have a period of some questions and some reflections together. And you'll have access to the PowerPoint slides afterwards, because I hope what I can do is inspire you to think about this search for a personal mission statement as a kind of research project that you could undertake in the days and in the weeks just ahead. So I'm going to go ahead and start into my slides. And my topic is Finding Your Mission in Life, Wisdom from Cayce about discovering your soul's purpose. And part of what I'd like to do tonight is not just look at the Cayce material itself, but also provide some of the context about the time period in which he was living and working and what was going on in the world at that time, and who some of the other thought leaders were who contributed to this same kind of topic. But then also to explore some of the contemporary findings in psychology and in counseling that have a bearing on this same kind of an adventure, trying to identify a soul purpose or a personal mission statement. Now, I was fortunate 15 or 16 years ago to get a phone call one day from a publisher or an editor at Penguin, one of the big publishing companies in New York City. And they were putting together a series of books, The Essential This and The Essential That, and trying to pick some of the key figures in spiritual studies. And they asked me if I would write a book on Edgar Cayce's work. So this is kind of an author's dream come true, to have an editor call oneself and say, hey, would you write a book for us? And it was a special opportunity for me, after decades of working with this material, to try to step back and ask myself, what did I think was really at the heart of his philosophy and his psychology? And so the book especially focuses on the non-medical readings that Edgar Cayce gave, his discourses about the nature of the body-mind connection and the way in which we go about finding purpose in life. And in this book, I've tried to especially feature two central principles. In a lot of ways, these are the two central principles for my sharing with you tonight. The first one is the purposefulness of life, and the second is the continuity of life. In Cayce's philosophy, when he spoke of the purposefulness of life, I think he meant this in at least two ways. First of all, that all of life is purposeful. This is not just something where we're trying to figure out our own mission statement, but instead we need to recognize how everyone's life has purpose and how all of nature is purposeful and our relationship with nature. And then in that same context, that each individual life has a meaning or a purpose. And then a second central principle is the continuity of life. And for any of you who've studied Cayce's work or similar kinds of philosophies, you probably know that Cayce felt like we've been here before and that we'll be back. So he believed in reincarnation, always in human form for human beings. I think he implies that we may have a lot of mistaken notions about what reincarnation is and how it works. I don't think Mark Thurston has ever been here before. but perhaps there may have been people who lived before me that I, in my current consciousness, have a special relationship to and can draw upon the patterns and skills and strengths and even weaknesses that came from those lifetimes, and that will be back. I've always thought that the theory of reincarnation was as much prospective as it was retrospective. It's asking us to consider that some of the tough things that we may be challenged to work on are worth working on because we have a long time frame view that looks out over the decades and centuries ahead. The other way in which Cayce uses the phrase of the continuity of life that I think is really critical to our discussion tonight is that all of life is connected. There's a continuity that isn't so much temporal as it is the way in which we are connected to each other, we're connected to all of life, that there's a kind of interbeing in which we participate. And so there's no private fulfillment. One of Cayce's famous sayings is, we get to heaven leaning on the arm of somebody else that we've helped. One of the first lectures I ever went to when I was a college student was given by one of my first lectures about the Cayce material was given by Edgar Cayce's son, Shealy and Dr, and I was just 18 or 19 years old. And I remember at that talk that was given to 200 people or so in an auditorium in Houston, Texas, where I was going to college. And he said in his lecture, none of us are going anywhere until we all go together. And I was really annoyed to hear that. I was impatient for spiritual growth. I could see there were clearly people dragging their feet, and I didn't want to be held back. And over the years, I've come to appreciate more and more Cayce's sense that there's a continuity of life, that all of life is connected, that we are part of a process with each other. I think this phrase interbeing is especially appropriate. So how do you and I go about searching for meaning in times that are as turbulent and as troubled as what we're experiencing right now? As I've been thinking over the last couple of weeks about doing this talk and also watching the news and reading the newspaper and seeing how much turmoil and chaos there is in the world around us, it almost seemed like it would be a luxury for any of us to be thinking about how to write a mission statement. But as I thought about this some more, it occurred to me that when Cayce was doing his work and giving these so-called life readings to nearly 2,000 different people over about a 20-year period from the early 1920s to the mid-1940s, that was a very turbulent time. That was a time of great trouble. Most of the life readings were given either during the Depression era or while World War II was going on. And surely we can appreciate how those times had just as much turbulence and uncertainty as what we're facing today. So I think this material does have relevance. Many of you may be familiar with the Gospel of Thomas that was found near Nagamati in Egypt in the late 1940s. This is writings, teachings of Jesus that came from the first century Christian church, the Coptic Christian church. And the first saying in the Gospel of Thomas, first saying attributed to Jesus, says, if you are searching, you must not stop until you find. So let's imagine it's something like searching for your mission in life, searching for your soul purpose. It's saying you got to keep working at it. Don't stop until you find. When you find, however, you will become troubled. Your confusion will give way to wonder. In wonder, you will reign over all things. Your sovereignty will be your rest. Now, there's a lot of mystery in that passage. I'm sure you've noticed that the first two lines are familiar from the Gospels that we know about in the traditional Bible. The idea here is that perhaps there was more to the saying that got rather truncated. And it's saying maybe some things we don't want to hear, that when we go on a search, we're liable to find what we're looking for, but it may disturb us, it may trouble us. But we need to be willing to hang in there with the confusion, because in time that can give way to awe and wonder. And in so doing, we begin to cultivate a kind of self-mastery, this kind of sovereignty or this kind of self-mastery can lead to a deeper kind of spiritual rest for us and peace of mind. In my university teaching to undergraduate students about mindfulness and positive psychology and well-being, I've taught a course for many years on mindfulness and meaning and life purpose. And one of the books I use is not by an academic, instead by an investigative reporter, Greg Lavoie. This book was published in the 1990s. It's entitled Callings, Finding and Following an Authentic Life. And I think any of you who are interested in the Cayce material about soul purpose would really find this to be valuable reading. Basically, Lavoie went out and interviewed people who thought they had found their life purpose, who thought they had been able to experience a calling or a sense of mission, and then had done that hard work of trying to manifest it, to live authentically. Here's a picture of Greg. His other and more recent book is called Vital Signs, Discovering and Sustaining Your Passion for Life. But I particularly like the first book, Callings. And I've selected a passage for us to look at out of that first book. And it has to do with the necessary role of turbulence and disorientation. So just when we think that all the chaos going on in the world around us is getting in the way and keeping us from being able to do serious spiritual work or keeping us from being able to find a sense of soul purpose, he's saying, no, maybe that kind of turbulence is really a necessary part of the process. Here's just one short paragraph from Callings. Recently, an acquaintance of mine who has searched for many years for a sense of direction and mission revealed that he was waiting for an unshakable vision. Maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you can think about a time in your life when you didn't want to move forward unless you really felt like you had been getting clear guidance coming from a high level or a deep level from within yourself. But Lavoie writing says, I immediately thought of the work of the Belgian physicist Ilya Prigogine, who was awarded the Nobel Prize, it was actually in chemistry, for his theory of what he calls dissipative structures, part of which contends that friction is a fundamental property of nature and that nothing grows without it. Not mountains, not pearls, not people. It's precisely the quality of fragility, he says, the capacity for being shaken up, that is paradoxically the key to growth. Any structure, whether at the molecular, chemical, physical, social, psychological level, that is insulated from disturbance is also protected from change, and it becomes stagnant. Now, this is a passage that my college students, who are generally between 19 and 24 years old, are able to relate to deeply and often, I think, experience considerable relief that maybe the challenges that they're facing at an economic level, at a career choice level, at a relationship level, really has behind it something meaningful and purposeful that is helping them to unfold and to grow in a necessary way. And even if we're not in that same age group, I think this is a principle that always holds true in life. Another book that I like to work with my college students is by two scholars from UCLA. They're both been teaching for many decades in the School of Education, and they founded the UCLA Center for Spirituality in Higher Education and conducted a very extensive multiple-year research project with more than 100,000 college students about the way in which college could be a period of time in which one's inner life can be cultivated. And out of their research work came a definition of spirituality in contrast to religion, and spirituality having these 5 domains. And I want us to think about each of these 5. The first is immediately on point to what we're doing tonight, a search for meaning, that is inherently something that is a spiritual task. It doesn't require the forms and the rituals of a religious structure. It's something that can be related to one's religion, but stand apart from it, the search for meaning. They also found that these other 4 qualities were part of spirituality. And For those of you who are students of the Cayce material, you know that they speak about all 5 of these, actually. Equanimity is another word for peace of mind, or being able to stabilize the mind, to be able to find clarity of mind. And this is what meditation particularly can help us to cultivate. I think that any of us who are on a search for a soul's purpose or a capacity to see and to write down a personal mission statement need to be able to find ways to cultivate equanimity, whether that's through a meditation practice or time in nature or whatever helps you to achieve a peace of mind. The third quality from the Aston's work is ethic of caring. This is basically compassion. It's being open-hearted, seeing that one's own journey in life, one's own search for spirituality is deeply connected to other people. And this is sort of an attitude. It's a kind of open-heartedness. It's a frame of mind. It's a perspective on the world. In contrast to the fourth quality here in the list, which they labeled as charitable involvement, basically means doing something with that caring. It means getting out in the world and doing things to help other people. And this is what Cayce so often in the life readings gave admonishments to people, would be so important. That it's never going to be enough to plan out your mission in life. It's going to have to include some kind of involvement in the world, some way of using your gifts and talents and strengths to make the world a better place in a very concrete and very specific way of involvement. And then the fifth quality from the Aston's work about spirituality is what they called ecumenical worldview. And this is basically the capacity to get inside the thinking of somebody else and appreciate another person's way of seeing things without necessarily dropping your own way of seeing things, but to be able to sympathize or to be empathetic about what they're going through and how they see things. Really, it's a kind of intuitive capacity in many ways. It's often beyond logic, a willingness to open our hearts and to open that intuitive side of our mind to be able to take things in as other people see them. So maybe we can think about these qualities as we begin to move towards shaping a personal mission statement later. Another person whose work I'm particularly fond of overlaps, in a sense, with Edgar Cayce's own life, Viktor Frankl, and the therapeutic method that he developed called logotherapy, which is basically logo or logos meaning, and the therapeutic or healing capacity of finding meaning in one's life. And Frankl felt that the most important thing a person could do to transform their life would be to get clear about meaning. And his experiences grew out of the horrific time that he had during World War II of being thrown into a concentration camp. All of his family was imprisoned. Virtually all of them died in concentration camps. He survived, went on to develop his practice as a psychiatrist and become world-renowned. Many people have said that Man's Search for Meaning is one of the 20 most important books of the 20th century. It's a fairly short read. I really encourage you to read this book if you haven't. Half of the book is his story about being in the concentration camp and the way in which he came to see that every day he had a choice about his attitude. No matter what the outer circumstances were, he always had a choice about what his attitude would be, how he would take that in, how he would respond. And out of the most horrific kind of circumstances, he then challenges us in our own life circumstances to shape meaning out of the inner choices that we're making about our ideals and about our attitudes. I picked out a couple of passages that I wanted to feature here. This is from Man's Search for Meaning. One should not search for an abstract meaning of life. Everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life. So he's certainly resonating with the Cayce material in that regard. Everyone must carry out a concrete assignment that demands fulfillment. Therein he cannot be replaced, nor can his life be repeated. Thus, everyone's task is as unique as is his specific opportunity to implement it. And from another of Viktor Frankl's books, The Doctor and the Soul, shorter statement, I've said that man or woman should not ask what he may expect from life, but rather understand that life expects something from him. That really is a challenge to turn our thinking around, isn't it? We so often, I think, ask ourselves, what can I expect of this? What's in it for me? Or what's going to be pleasing to me? Or what's going to make me feel good? Those are natural questions to ask. But he's asking us to flip the coin over and also realize that life expects something from us. And that's the key to taking responsibility for our lives. I want to include a little bit from published research and science. Because I'm a university professor, I can't help it. I think this is really important. Seems to me, particularly in the last 20 years, health science, positive psychology, social psychology has been studying the impact of meaning on people's lives, their health, and their psychological well-being. And these are just some of the highlights from different research studies. People who have a higher level of meaning in life have a higher quality of life satisfaction. They have higher self-reported health. They report adjusting better in their jobs than those who don't have a high sense of meaning. They have a lower frequency of psychological disorders. They have less frequent suicidal thoughts. This next one is interesting. They appear to be more appealing to other people. In other words, other people tend to see those who have a high level of meaning as being the sort of people they want to be around. People who have a high level of meaning have slower age-related decline in their cognitive abilities, lower risk for Alzheimer's disease, greater life expectancy, lower risk of heart attack and stroke. That's a pretty good list, isn't it? I see a lot of things on that list that I'd like to have in my life. And it suggests, even though this is correlational data, but it suggests that perhaps if we would work systematically and very intentionally on seeing and fostering greater meaning in life, that some of these qualities that are listed here in the bullet points might also happen to a greater degree in our lives. So 3 years ago, I published the second edition of my book, Discovering Your Soul's Purpose. It had come out in the 1980s, and I had a great opportunity with Penguin to publish an edition of the book that would reach a much wider audience. And I also felt like I knew a lot more about the topic than I had in the mid-1980s. In the intervening years, I did one-day workshops on this topic to probably 50 or 60 different audiences in 50 or 60 different cities around the United States and Canada. I think in 8 or 10 different other countries. And I've made DVDs around this and lots of audio tapes and done some research about it. So it's really something that's been a part of my professional blood for a long, long time. So this was a great opportunity for me to be able to take some of the case studies of people that I'd worked with and weave them into a new second edition. So like the first edition of the book, it features a 5-step methodology for how you and I can go about writing a mission statement, basically, or engaging in a personal research project to see if we can find evidence that what we think our mission or soul purpose might be really is something that leads to personal fulfillment and works for the greater good. So these 5 steps are what I found in studying the nearly 2,000 so-called life readings that Edgar Cayce gave from the mid-1920s to the mid-1940s. Now, I haven't read all 2,000 of them, but most of them. And as I would study them, I saw there was a kind of template there, sort of an approach that he would take, just as a spiritual coach or a therapist might do in working with people on a particular topic. There was a kind of rhythm, there was a kind of regimen that made sense for self-exploration, and he would use the architecture or the scaffolding of that methodology to present the material in a life reading. And I think you and I can just extract that methodology out of the collective body of Cayce life readings and say, well, how would this work in my own life? So the first step, and this is done in different ways in different life readings, but it has to do with clarifying a spiritual ideal. And sometimes Cayce would have a short discourse in his coaching or his advice to the recipient just about the importance of knowing what they believe in, knowing what their ideal is. On other occasions, this first step was accomplished by him drawing a distinction in his spiritual psychology between the personality and the individuality. And he says that the personality is the more familiar sense of self that each of us has. It's what we show to the world. It's the persona. And it's necessary to have a personality to function in life. It operates largely by habit, kind of by automatic pilot, by routine. It'd be difficult, if you can imagine, to drive a car if you couldn't put yourself sort of on automatic pilot doing it. So we need to have this kind of familiar, habit-driven self. But to the extent that our personality has taken over and we've lost touch with kind of a deeper, more authentic core, that's what Greg Lavoie would call it in his Callings book, our authenticity, or the essence of who we are at a deeper, usually more unconscious level. And Cayce calls this the individuality. And he says that this individuality is what's capable of having a relationship with divinity or the divine. It's in a sense a kind of higher self, but it's not fully developed, it's not fully formed, it's still in the process of growth and development, but it's capable of development. It's not so stuck in routine and habit, so to speak. So there's lots of ways to go about clarifying one's ideal. I'll talk about that in just a little bit, but that's going to be a first step in what I'm going to suggest to you as a kind of research project that you could undertake. Now, the second thing Cayce would do in a life reading, and this was almost always by far the longest part of a life reading, when a life reading was stenographically recorded and typed up, be maybe 3 to 5 pages long, and maybe half of the reading was probably the second phase, where he was helping the person to identify their core talents and strengths. Now, embedded in that part of the reading was also some self-exploration about patterns of weakness and self-sabotage. But for today, we're especially focusing on the way in which we need to see our abilities, our capacities, our strengths, our talents, our gifts. And I'm going to suggest some ways that we might go about doing that. Cayce used the language of past lives and the language of astrology to do this descriptive sharing with the recipient of a reading. His approach to astrology was not sun signs. It wasn't like talking about, well, I'm an Aquarian and so I'm like this or that. It was instead referring to the influence of planetary forces. And frankly, as a psychologist, I just see this as a way of him developing sort of a schema of temperament, that there's a Jupiterian temperament, and there's a Martian kind of temperament, and there's a Venus-oriented temperament, and different people's personalities feature these different temperamental tendencies. And so I think he was using that kind of language sort of as a psychologist in a way. And then he would tell these past life stories. He would recount narratives about previous incarnations and the way in which certain talents, strengths, and abilities were developed, or even certain predispositions to self-sabotage or to limitation or selfishness had been developed and needed to be dealt with in the present. Now, you don't have to believe in reincarnation to work with this approach. If you're still thinking about it, or if you're pretty sure reincarnation isn't what happens, you can still work with this strategy. The second step is just finding ways to identify what these gifts are that you have. Now, the third step, in Cayce he did not always do this. There are some readings where he doesn't articulate a succinct statement of personal mission or soul purpose. There's some people who got readings where he did this for them. For others, he kind of leaves it as homework for the person to figure out. But there's enough where he gave examples of a personal mission statement that we'll look at some examples, and I can kind of coach you through a strategy for how you could eventually write your own. Now, it's never enough just to have a statement. We got to have some way of applying it. And so the fourth step in our research project that I'm proposing, or a fourth step in the readings themselves, it would be to challenge ourselves with how we're going to put this to the test. How can we take this out and begin to work with it in a very practical fashion? And I'll describe to you in a few moments how you might structure or create an application plan for yourself once you've written at least a draft of a mission statement. But then, because this is a research project, we've got to have some way of evaluating what's going on. And Cayce sometimes names signposts that could happen in a person's life when they were really in resonance with their mission, when they were really in sync with their calling, some of the qualities of life that would appear. I want to digress just a tiny bit and share with you one of my favorite little video clips from Robin Williams and the Dead Poets Society. It's a little 6-minute clip, which is somewhat lengthy, but it's really right on point about mission and life. But some context is going to be necessary here because the character, the high school English teacher that Robin Williams is portraying in Dead Poets Society, is speaking to his high school students about Walt Whitman, great American poet and humanist, transcendentalist, and he's going to quote from a passage in Whitman's famous and classic book, Leaves of Grass. It's just a tiny little segment out of Leaves of Grass. So look at it here on screen, because when Robin Williams recites part of it, he kind of goes fast. And the reason I particularly like this little 6-minute video I'm going to show you is because Walt Whitman, among the many things he did in life, was a nurse in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War. And he watched the utter craziness and insanity that was unfolding in America between 1861 and 1865. We may think it's crazy and insane what's going on in our world today, and yeah, it sort of is, but we're not the first to experience this. And you can see here in Leaves of Grass that Whitman is talking about this kind of frustration that we can feel, the sense of real discouragement and sadness. So he writes, "Oh me, O life, of the questions of these recurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish." Don't we see that on the news every night? "Of myself forever reproaching myself, for who more foolish than I, who more faithless?" So at least he's willing to look and see that it isn't just everybody else out there that's messing up. He recognized that he himself is a contributor to the state of the world. "Of eyes that vainly crave the light, of objects mean, of the struggles ever renewed, of the poor results of all, of the plotting and sordid crowds I see around me, of the empty and useless years of the rest, and the rest me intertwined." Again, I'm part of this whole thing too. "The question, O me, O sad recurring, what good among these, O me, O life?" What good is there in the midst of all this chaos and turbulence? And then in the poem itself, Whitman has written, "Answer, period." And then he begins again. It's as if he's gotten an inspiration. Some higher wisdom speaks to him that you are here, that life exists, and identity, that the powerful play goes on, and you will contribute a verse. So in this sense, we need to remember that just the fact that we are alive, that we have existence, that we have a sense of identity, is evidence that there is some good in the midst of even the chaos and the turbulence. And that this powerful play that's been going on for centuries will continue, and that each of us has a verse to contribute. So I've got some material here in my slide deck that has to do with examples from the Edgar Cayce life readings. And because you're going to be receiving an email with a link that'll take you to a recording of tonight's session and access to the slide deck, you really have an opportunity, if you are intrigued by this, to go back and look at some of the excerpts that I've picked out of these sample readings in a little more careful way. So I'm going to move through this part a little more quickly. But one sample was given for a 61-year-old woman who had recently been widowed. It was given in May of 1943 during World War II. She had come down to Virginia Beach to be present for the reading. And I particularly like this reading for several reasons. One is she was in her 60s, and his advice to her about life purpose was not something about, well, get ready for retirement. He first of all told her what the first principles are about getting to know oneself. And again, you can come back to this with a link tomorrow or later and read this more carefully if you'd like. But then there's this great passage, this, in a sense, famous passage from Cayce about each of us we all have a mission to perform. He's asserting that everybody's got a soul purpose. Everyone has a mission to perform. And then he goes on to give some thematic guidance to this woman about what hers may be. And I put the word thematic in capital letters here at the top, because more often than not, a statement of purpose or a statement of mission isn't overly specific. It doesn't pin us down to just a particular job that might be done at one point in life. It's a little more thematic and can be applied professionally and in one's personal life at different points in a lifespan. And so he's pointing her towards a mission statement that has something to do with being a channel to other people, helping them to edit and correct and interpret what they have to share. That her gift is helping people to shape their writings or their teachings so that it can be understood and appreciated by more and more people. The second sample is a 32-year-old woman married with 2 children who came with her husband to Virginia Beach in June of 1942. They each got readings, life readings. And I actually, in writing for Venture Inward magazine for the fall issue of 2020, featured this particular reading in my article. And I like this reading, again, just because of some of the extraordinary statements that are made. He's emphasizing that she's going to influence a lot of people in her life, but it's not predetermined whether it's going to be for good or for ill. And it depends on her choices. This is going to be true for all of us. It depends upon choices of those tenets and ideals that are chosen by the soul or by the entity. And he goes on to describe how each of us can be seen, or we can begin to experience ourselves as being like a shadow of something bigger, of the eternal or the authentic self. That each of us is, in a sense, like a projection of something bigger. And it sort of harkens back to Plato's Allegory of the Cave. If you remember this story that Plato tells, these prisoners are chained up, so all they can do is look forward and see shadows that are cast on the wall of the cave, and a great fire is a source of light. And people are walking by holding 3-dimensional objects like a soldier or a horse or what have you. And the light of the fire is casting a shadow, a 2-dimensional shadow of these 3-dimensional objects. And Plato's putting this forward as an allegory or a metaphor about the nature of reality, that you and I see we see a shadow world. Our personalities, our individuality, our sense of individual self, my Mark Thurstonness, is really just a shadow of something higher, a shadow of the eternal, is the way Cayce put it. And then he goes on to tell this 32-year-old woman what her mission is: to be a teacher, an instructor, a director of groups, working for peace among all people. So he's not pinning this down to any particular job. In fact, the woman went on to go to law school, work in the district attorney's office. She eventually became a judge in New York City. and was still in correspondence with Edgar Cayce's secretary, Gladys Davis, in the late 1950s, and writing about how she was still serving as a judge in New York City courts. It's a really interesting case study. And again, if you want to use the link we'll be sending you to go back and look at the slide deck, there's more details for those of you that might find this interesting. So how many missions do any of us have? Well, first, Cayce would say we all share a common mission. In his philosophy, there's several ways in which the essence of that common mission can be described: to bring love consciously into the material world, to make the infinite finite, to know ourselves, to be ourselves, yet one with God. Different ways of saying basically the same thing, a common mission that we share. But then at a personal level, one's mission might well evolve through different periods of one's life, in a new phase of life, as a new sense of ideal emerges, maybe even a fresh sense of talents and gifts. Then a new wording for a personal mission would make sense. And so even if you successfully write a statement of soul purpose or a mission statement, you may find that later in your life, as things begin to change, that maybe a new mission begins to come into focus. I'm coming into sort of the homework phase that I'm going to be giving you. And these are slides that I'm going to be inviting you to come back and look at, because they sort of outline steps that you could take in the days ahead. And in about 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to be taking a few questions. So as you're thinking of questions you'd like to pose to me, they can be posted to the chat room, and I'll eventually be getting those sent to me for the Q&A time. Let's move right ahead here. So we come back to this 5-step methodology. I put at the bottom of this slide the need for a curious and playful approach for this personal research project. Let's not get too compulsive about this. It needs to be kind of a fun self-exploration adventure. Clarifying your ideal is the first step. Your ideal is a central motivating force that you choose to direct your life decisions. It's also a way of labeling the essence of your individuality self. It's a way of labeling who you feel you are at your most authentic. It's a statement that constellates the kind of highest and the best qualities that you've gotten a taste of in yourself, even if you're not able to sustain them very frequently. Sort of yourself as you best know yourself. And writing that out, maybe as a single word, but more likely as a statement that's a long phrase or even a sentence. This is something we need to return to from time to time. But Cayce would say this is a good starting point. I'm not going to go ahead and read this tonight just for purposes of time, but I've been a student of Rudolf Steiner's work, who was roughly a contemporary of Edgar Cayce. He was born in 1861 and died in 1925 and lived in Central Europe. Some of you are familiar with Waldorf schools or biodynamic agriculture, and these were formulated by Rudolf Steiner. And Steiner distinguishes between what he calls innate idealism and achieved idealism. And he says, as you would see if you come back and read this quote later, that in youth, say 18 to 24 years old, or the typical college student that I'm working with day in, day out, there's an innate kind of idealism. And for those of you that have moved on past that period of life, perhaps you can remember having a deep sense of meaning or passion or vision about purpose. But Steiner says we need to move on in life, and later in life reach for what he calls achieved idealism. And this is where we take hold of the forces of will and we begin to actually manifest some of these ideals. Innate idealism and achieved idealism. They don't have to stand in competition to each other. They can be like a pair, a complementary pair. And I find that just going back and remembering my innate idealism when I was, say, 20 years old, helps me at this phase in life as I'm trying to work on my achieved idealism and my current sense of purpose. One of my favorite Cayce passages about working with an ideal says, but know again, it must be guided aright. He without an ideal is sorry indeed. He with an ideal and lacking courage to live it is sorrier still. Know that. Okay, we got to do something with those ideals. Now, if you remember, the second part of the research project is to get some clarity about what your core strengths and talents are. And this could take hours for us to do justice to, but I'm going to invite you to think about what your gifts and talents and aptitudes are, particularly in 4 areas. First of all, who do you admire? Who are the people in your life that you admire? And the psychology of admiration, as I like to think of it, is positive projection, because we see in others that we admire qualities that also exist within ourselves. Perhaps we know about projection when it's used in a more negative way, but let's think about positive projection and how this can give us a clue about some of our core strengths and talents. We can also look back to the key accomplishments that we've had in life and to ask ourselves, what were the strengths and talents and aptitudes that I had to draw upon in this accomplishment or that accomplishment? And I always encourage people to pick different types of accomplishments so they can get kind of a broad array of strengths and talents. Strange as it may sound, sometimes we can have a potential strength that is hiding in a weakness. That something that we see ourselves or others see in us as a fault or a weakness may have embedded in it a strength, a talent, or a gift that's just being overdone or perhaps being used in a selfish way. But we can go back and redeem that, and we can claim that strength or talent. I've often found in working with people that such a talent or strength is really a key to them being able to see their mission statement. And then one of my favorites is what I playfully call bench warmers. And this is an analogy going back to sports teams in which the team is made up of more people than can get into the game at any one time. So a basketball team might have 12 members of the team, only 5 are out on the court at any given moment. And other members of the team rotate in from time to time, but often there's 2 or 3 players that never get into the game. And they get playfully called bench warmers because they're always sitting on the bench. But you and I may have a sense that we've got a talent or a strength or a gift and it's just never gotten into the game yet. But we can feel it's there. And that needs to be part of the conversation as we're thinking about writing a mission statement. Now, usually when people go through some self-exploration using exercises like this, they're going to get a list that may be 12 or 15 or 18 different talents, strengths, and abilities. But when Cayce gave a life reading, he usually narrowed it down to just 4 or 5 core talents or strengths. So how would you and I take a list of 15 or 16 gifts, talents, and strengths and figure out which 4 or 5 are most critical to shaping the character of our mission statement? One exercise is to ask yourself, what were you like as a young child, especially before you started school? Sometimes the authentic self, the individuality, is showing through early in life, and a talent or a gift that was showing itself even in rudimentary form early in life may be one that needs to be part of that smaller list of 4 or 5. We can ask ourselves, do any of my talents and strengths or abilities have the feeling of being right at the core of my being? It's hard for me to imagine being me without that gift, talent, or strength. If so, that's probably one of the ones Cayce would have named for you if you had had him as a spiritual coach giving you a life reading about personal mission. And another question that I found fruitful in working with people is to ask, do any of your talents and strengths seem to speak to you with a feeling of unfinished business, sort of unrealized possibilities? There's a sense that that gift or that talent is meant to be used in some further way, even if you don't quite have a sense of what that is. Now let's suppose over the days or weeks, you can begin to make some progress on identifying 4 or 5, and you get to the point where you're now going to try to draft a mission statement. I found it helpful to look at the way in which this can work for an organization. Maybe you've worked for an organization where there was a collective mission statement. Here are some examples. The American Red Cross, to provide relief to victims of disasters and help people prevent, prepare for, and respond to emergencies. It's really elegant. It beautifully describes the kind of service that they're in the work to do, who they're trying to help. Our daughter works for an organization in Washington, D.C. that's actually an international organization working with particularly women's health issues. And here's a statement of their mission statement. Some of us shop at Trader Joe's. Here's their mission statement. The Center for the Advancement of Well-Being, where I work at George Mason University, has a lovely mission statement. And I'm particularly intrigued with Colonial Williamsburg's mission statement, because I thought it was going to be something quite different. And then when I read it, I was surprised. To feed the human spirit by sharing America's enduring story. It's very poetic, isn't it? I think it nicely illustrates how this process of writing a mission statement can be an artistic as much as a scientific endeavor. So as I mentioned, I've been working with people for 30 years around being able to write a mission statement. And here are 4 tips that I have found useful in working with people, sort of giving them 4 different flavors that they might try as their first drafting a mission statement. One approach is to begin with an opening metaphor, to be a, and almost have a symbol that captures or describes the essence of what that mission is all about. These are real examples from people that I've worked with. To be a springboard, to propel people and ideas to a higher expression. And that's a mission that could be lived professionally, avocationally, in relationship to family and friends. Somebody else to be a bridge, someone who uses his sensitivity and broad-mindedness to create pathways for understanding and harmony between opposing sides. Lovely image there, beginning with a metaphor, an opening image. Another one, to be an anchor, creating stability and safety to myself, my family, and the organizations of which I'm a part. So that's one approach that you could take, is a sort of a central image. Another approach is to have a focal point verb, what your mission is calling you to be doing in life. Here's 2 examples. To synthesize and bring together the fragments of life into an interconnected whole. Again, this is thematic, and the person's challenged to see ways in which that could be applied professionally, in their hobbies, in their way of being with themselves, with their family members. Another example, again, with a focal point verb, to direct and manage people, to bring out their best. Another approach is to name the audience or the type of people that you aim to help and to serve. Here's 2 examples, again, 2 different people. To magnify ideals and aspirations in those who are discouraged or who have lost hope. So it's sort of naming the audience. Who's the population that one's calling is meant to serve? Someone else, to use my resourcefulness and optimism to support and coach people who seek to transcend their disabilities. Again, naming the audience. And then a 4th approach is to focus on key gifts and talents and skills that you want to draw upon and to make them central to the way that you word the mission. And here's one example of that: to intuitively and wisely use words, written and spoken, to bring peace of mind and understanding in the world. Now we're starting to come near the end of our time, so I'm going to talk for just a couple more minutes, and then let's see what questions we have. But let me briefly describe the last 2 steps in this research project. Step 4 is to create a plan. So let's suppose you've written a mission statement and it looks good on paper, but is it really what your calling is all about? So we need small scale, small steps to put the mission statement into application. Some things that you could be doing in relationship to other people and to the world around you. Maybe 1 or 2 commitments that might take 2 weeks to a month. And then some small steps, just 1 or 2, for how you could live the mission statement towards yourself. That's really important, to live it towards yourself as well. And then what's going to happen in your life? This is step 5 in the research project. These are things that Cayce named as happening in people's lives when they're living authentically, when they're on track with their calling. You're going to recognize that the lives of other people are benefiting by your own actions. You're going to feel closer to the divine in whatever way you would experience that, and it's different for different people. You're going to notice that frequently there's a certain timing of resources and opportunities coming to you just when they're needed for you to be able to take the next step in sort of a synchronistic sort of way. A fourth one is to feel connected to energy that seems to come from beyond yourself. We've all had this experience. We're not really sure where the energy came from. It seemed to come from beyond ourselves, and that can be a signpost that we're really connecting to our own individuality and what we're here to be doing in life. And then Cayce named one emotion that he said more than any other emotion that would characterize the life of somebody who was living his or her purpose, and that's joyfulness. It's joyfulness. Now, I've put into the slide deck a couple of examples of people using this 5-step approach. This is what I'm challenging and inviting you to do in the weeks just ahead, to come up with a wording for your own spiritual ideal, to use the exercises that I had on a previous slide to perhaps at first get a long list of key talents and strengths, and then to narrow it down to the 4 or maybe 5 that feel most central to who you are and your deepest, most authentic self. And then to go ahead and choose one of those 4 formats to draft a mission statement, at least the first draft of a mission statement. So you can see here in the case of Kate, who was a counseling client of mine. At the time she was 24, she was working as a beautician, and she ended up writing a mission statement to help people to get a new self-image. Okay, that really sounded promising, but she's got to put it into application in some ways that really test and challenge her. And so she came up with an application plan here. At her job, she was going to very intentionally start being more conscious of the psychological as well as the physical changes that she was helping make in the lives of her clients. With her friends and her family, she was going to make an effort to point out more frequently the positive qualities and the accomplishments that she could see in them. And then very importantly, towards herself, she was going to very purposefully, intentionally cultivate one of her talents, sense of humor. She was going to take a clowning workshop. She wanted to get some training in something she didn't think she was very good at, to try to sort of develop some new sense of herself and her own competence. She decided to get some training around computer skills. And the idea then was to watch for any of these signposts beginning to show up. Yeah. And then I did the steps on myself just in the last couple of weeks. I rewrote a statement of my own spiritual ideal to be a servant and channel of the universal Christ consciousness. I had my long list of talents and strengths and abilities, and most recently I narrowed it down to thinking these 4 were the most important: industriousness, being verbally skillful, good at synthesizing different viewpoints. You may or may not agree with that after watching this kind of complicated slideshow, and being patient. And here's the latest wording of my own mission statement: to create learning structures that help people get a new sense of life and of themselves. Kind of sounds good, but what's the cutting edge of my application plan with that? I'm trying at my job as a university professor to more frequently create learning opportunities for my students and to help them find ways to test and challenge themselves, where they create the challenge for themselves rather than just doing what I'm challenging them to do. I think that kind of a learning structure is sort of a cutting edge thing for me. With friends and family, to be more playful, creating games to help especially our grandchildren to grow and build their confidence. They're 1 and 4 years old. And then towards myself, to create some learning structures where my day has more downtime in it and more space, and just to see what happens. So those are my current application plan. And again, I'm trying to work with watching for any of those signposts to be confirming. So I'm going to begin to look at some of the questions here. There's a question that came in. What if you desire to expand in a way that you're challenged? For me, it's communication. So I want to pursue areas to expand and overcome. That's seeing a potential strength hidden in a weakness. Yeah, I think that really allows us to take this kind of process to a much deeper level when we're willing to almost work alchemically with ourselves. If we think about how the ancient alchemists were trying to turn lead into gold, but what they were really doing was taking those aspects of the personality and asking how can they be transformed into something that can live in service to the higher good. And I think that for any of us who really want to work soulfully, who really want to take this kind of finding your mission in life very seriously, we got to be willing to challenge ourselves at this level. Writing a mission statement is not something you just do once. I mean, I just shared with you what I wrote here in the last 10 days for myself. And I've been doing this for 35 years with myself. And so there's always kind of a next application plan. There's always a new sense of, well, maybe a different talent or strength is beginning to emerge for me, or maybe tweaking the mission statement to begin to feature a different kind of challenge that feels like it's on the horizon for me. So in that sense, I think it's lovely that the person who was asking this first question feels ready to do that themselves. And here's a comment from my longtime friend, Linda, who teaches eurythmy in Rudolf Steiner School in Manhattan. The Manhattan Waldorf School was the first one in the United States, going back 90 years. Our two children went to Waldorf schools for 5 years here in Virginia, and I think they're in their 30s now, and I can still see the way in which it was impactful for them. It really works with the whole child. And whenever I would visit a Waldorf kindergarten, it made me want to be a 4-year-old once again. Let's see, do we have other? There's a question about whether the word value is synonymous with ideal. I think in some ways it can be. Cayce uses the word ideal in a number of different fashions because he's always speaking to the individual person and trying to relate to them in their language. And sometimes he talks about ideals in terms of our beliefs, knowing what you believe, because your beliefs are reflecting your ideals. I think the word value is perhaps the most important and useful synonym for ideal. I also like the word motivation, or sort of a guiding influence. The thing about an ideal is it's both aspirational, but it also needs to be something that we trust. So I think we need to have at least had tastes of it. We need to have had momentary encounters where we experienced that quality lives in us, even if we find it hard on a day-to-day basis to measure up to it or to connect to it. And when something is a value simply because somebody told us that's what our value ought to be, or when something is an ideal just because we learned it at the temple or the mosque or the synagogue or church, then I think that gap between personal experience and what we're striving for is liable to lead to discouragement and kind of giving up on the whole process. We need to be able to trust our ideal. And I think that trust experience comes from at least having had some peak experiences where we got a taste of it, we got a flavor of it. I believe it was Abraham Maslow who coined this phrase, peak experience. And we've all had these moments where we got a taste of our individuality self. And I think Cayce's calling us to sort of claim those moments and to sort of constellate them, verbalize them, or if you're not comfortable trying to put into words, to draw a picture of it or have a way of dancing it, but some way of giving physical expression to what we aspire to and what we feel like we can trust. Another question that just came through, talent made up of strengths we're born with and analysis related to successes. that can point to life purpose. So I'm not sure I'm exactly understanding the wording of that question, but I think the important thing here is that our talents and our strengths, wherever they may come from, are pointing us in a direction. They're like the raw material with which we can work. But then if you remember, or you can look back later after you get the link to the slide deck, Cayce says this person, the woman who became a judge, was going to influence a lot of people, but it wasn't predetermined whether that was going to be for good or for ill. And so we can connect or have a sense with certain talents and strengths that we've got, but then there's still this business of our ideals and our will, and what are we going to do with it? Can we, to use Steiner's phrase, experience achieved idealism, in which we just very patiently work towards, line upon line, giving expression to the direction that those talents and those strengths point. So when you look at the slide deck, and I think tomorrow probably you're going to get an email that points you to a private YouTube page where you can listen to my talk again and see the slides. You'll see at the end of the slide deck that I've got some pictures from Egypt. I was going to tell you a story about when I was 22 years old and going on a vision quest, trying to find my own life purpose. And I would encourage you to think of the whole process of identifying a personal mission statement as being like a vision quest. We sort of prepare ourselves, we've got a question, we go out and test ourselves, we do something that may be very challenging, and then we come back, we return from that vision quest a changed person. And that happened for me when I was 22 and going to the Great Pyramid and getting to meditate in the King's Chamber and just having a little meditative experience that really spoke to me about the nature of my own calling, particularly in the context of my work with the A.R.E. So we have come to the end of our 75 minutes, and I have a slide near the end. If anybody wanted to write to me, up in the upper right corner is a internet page, markthurston.com, that will take you to the bios page of the Personal Transformation and Courage Institute, which my wife and I founded 20 years ago to be a nonprofit educational organization. And you can learn a little bit about Personal Transformation Courage Institute, or if you want to send me an email, markthurston.com will give you a way to do that. So thank you very much for being part of this tonight. Again, I hope what we've done for the last 75 minutes has just inspired you to keep it up, to go back and look at some of the slides in the slide deck that either bear more careful scrutiny or that inspired you and you want to be reminded of some of the core principles in Cayce's fabulous teachings about finding and living a soul purpose. So we are going to pause for tonight. Thank you again for being part of this, and I'll look forward to opportunities in the future to get to work with you. Good night.
For 36 years, and it was only the last 4 to 5 years I actually saw that Cayce did talk about the illusion of time. And so we're going to talk tonight about the Akashic records and the illusion of time. One of our challenges with this topic is that we are so used to our perception of the linear experience of time that it's hard to almost imagine anything else. But I'm going to walk you through some experiences tonight, experiences in the Cayce readings, experiences of other people, and experience that I myself have had that will suggest to you, as it does to me perhaps, that the linear perception of time may not be correct. In terms of the Akashic records, If you've ever heard me talk about the Akashic Records before, you may have heard me say that the Akashic Records are really the universe's supercomputer system. They help us keep track of the past, the present, and the future. In terms of the past, the Akashic Records hang on to issues related to our past experiences, past jobs, past relationships, not only in this life, but in lives past. So the Akashic Records of the past are really an ongoing databank of everything that has ever transpired in a soul's history. In terms of the Akashic Records of the present pull together everything a soul needs exactly when that soul needs it. In fact, I'm convinced that the Akashic Records of the present are what makes certain each and every one of us eventually make it. Each and every one of us will eventually get to enlightenment. Eventually. Free will does not mean that we get to choose the curriculum. It only means that we get to choose when we're willing to learn the lesson that's been presented to us. So we're going to talk about the Akashic Records of the present and how that dynamic works in our lives. We're going to talk about the Akashic Records of the future and how constantly we're in the process of pulling together or actually seeing experiences that are going to be happening in our future. Our future is not fixed. It's an ongoing conglomeration of probable realities. And so we're going to see how these Akashic Records and how the illusion of time interact to give us really an experience in consciousness. And that's really what this time illusion is all about. It's an experience in consciousness. So, to start, I want to pick out for you one quote that I think really illustrates how it's consciousness. Now, if any of you have ever seen the movie Kate and Leopold, this comes right from that movie Kate and Leopold. One of the characters' name is Stuart Besser, who discovers it's possible to travel through time. This is what he says. I know it sounds crazy, but it's no more crazy than a dog finding a rainbow. Dogs are colorblind. They don't see color, just like we can't see time. We can feel it, we can feel it passing, but we can't see it. But imagine if we could see time for what it really is. A universe, a world, a thing as unimaginable as color to a dog. And that's it. It's that simple. That's all I discovered. I'm just a guy who saw what no one else could see. I'm that dog who saw a rainbow. And the reason I picked that is because from Cayce's perspective, it's really all about consciousness, just like it's suggested in that quote. Time is an experience, an experiment even, in consciousness. So let's look at what the Cayce readings have to say. We're going to have a matter of definitions. Let's look at what they have to say, first of all, about the Akashic Records. Cayce called the Akashic Records the book of life. It's really the universe's supercomputer system. The Bible also refers to it as God's book of remembrance. Here's one of the readings. When there is the thought or the activity of the body in any particular environment, this very activity makes for the impressions. These are written upon what is known as time or space. The activity of energy expended leave its imprint upon the etheric wave. Now, the interesting thing about this, according to the readings, is that the energy expended by thought, an intense thought, is the very same as an actual deed. In other words, to think something with intensity is the same as to actually do it, because the energy that gets written on our Akashic record is the same. Remember, life is an experience in consciousness, so thoughts are a part of consciousness. And now Jesus' quote in the book of Matthew, where he told a group of men that to think about doing adultery is actually the same as doing it, because the energy that gets written on our personal Akashic record is the same, because life is an experience in consciousness. In terms of time, what is time? Is it a record merely of the events of self or the glory of God? In other words, time is an experience in consciousness, and is it an ongoing list of the things we've done for other people, for the divine, to expand our consciousness, or just what is it? Now is our present, it's our ancestors' future, and it's our descendants' past. And from Cayce's perspective, beyond the physical dimension, past, present, and future become meaningless because time in reality does not exist. For the Akashic records, where does this come from? It comes from the Sanskrit akasha, which means boundless space. And it could be conceived to essentially be all that exists. The Cayce reading suggests it's the record of every thought, deed, and word as an impression upon the skein of time. Now, as unusual as this Akashic field may seem to some of you, most of you have probably heard about the phenomenon of a near-death experience, where someone has a death experience, they clinically die, and then they have a life review. They see their life before them. What's actually happening is they see their own book of life, they tune into the Akashic etheric field, they see their own Akashic record during this near-death experience. It's somehow written. Every thought, every word, every deed that happens in this dimension is written next to the soul's name who actually did it. Now, some of us, I know, say, well, Edgar Cayce was able to read the Akashic records. I wish I could find a psychic who could read the Akashic records for me. And I'm going to tell you that every single person in this room is interacting and reading with the Akashic records all the time. We're constantly tuning into the Akashic records, constantly. Number one, because there's no other source of information. It's the source of all information that exists. But also, we've all had the experience of meeting someone for the very first time. And we have an experience of either really liking or really disliking that person. And where does that come from? We pick up our relationships exactly where we leave them off, and we pick up these impressions from the Akashic records. In terms of time, time is generally regarded as the measuring system to sequence events. Cayce said that time was one of three dimensions: time, space, and patience. Time is about consciousness. Time is about an experience in consciousness. Space, from Cayce's perspective, is about an experience in dimensions. We are currently in the third dimension. For those who didn't know, we are in the third dimension. And our job, as sparks of the divine, is to bring the divinity into the third dimension. We are employees for God. I usually say in every one of my lectures, we are employees for God. Our job is to bring divinity into the earth. Now, some of us are only working part-time. Some of us have forgot to clock in. And some of us are really committed to this. But our job is to bring divinity into the third dimension. So space is about dimension. And then patience is really the dynamic of a continuum where we do an act and we wait a while and we get to see what the outcome is. Or we have an experience with someone and then later on we get to see how that experience manifests. That's what patience is all about. So for every action, there's a reaction. There's a cause and there's an effect. And then there's memory. From Cayce's perspective, karma is only memory. And it's really this memory of, okay, I did this, and here was the outcome, and how can I make that better in the present? What can I do in the present to make that even better?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me again today. My name is Jessica Newell. I'm the archivist for the Edgar Cayce Foundation, and we're continuing our series from the archives celebrating A.R.E.'s 90th anniversary. So last week, we shared a post here on Facebook from our collection from the 1930s. So the list of people that were at the meeting beginning the A.R.E. in 1931. So this week, we're moving forward a decade to the 1940s, and I'll be sharing a really interesting document that we have from that era and how it ties in to our celebration of A.R.E.'s history. So we have a great collection of publications, everything that the A.R.E. has done from 1931 until the present day, And so we have a report from the dedication of the first offices and archive. I'm going to share with you a photograph that we have from 1940. Now this is Edgar Cayce's home on Arctic Crescent. Between the closing of the Cayce Hospital and the dedication, they rented several different homes around the beach, and in the early 30s settled on this house. Now on September 29th, 1940, they dedicated a whole new wing onto the house. Now if you see here on the left, that low rectangular building, that is the new archive and new offices, because up until that point, they had been keeping the readings, in boxes all over the house wherever they could find room. And you had the Cayce family, you had Gladys Davis working there, all of their staff all crowded into the house together. And, with visitors coming and going all the time. So they needed a dedicated workspace. So if we go to the next image I have here, this is actually a plan of the house dating a few years later, in 1944. And so Edgar Cayce's son, Hewlin, was serving in Europe during the Second World War. And this was drawn by his new friend Von Shelton, who actually came to work for A.R.E. after the war. And this is their plan for what they envisioned the headquarters to be. That rectangular portion on the right, that is the house and the new offices that we're talking about today. You have the library there, office for Gladys Davis and for Harmon Brough. All the records would be held in the top right-hand corner. And then they also had a reading room where they could invite researchers to use the readings. And so this was a plan before that they knew that they were able to buy back the hospital building. So this whole left side was never built. This is just one option that they were thinking about. Now, on September 29th, 1940, they had the dedication. They had a big group of people come out, study group members, local people, family, friends. And so we're lucky enough to have a booklet that they published and sent out to the membership. And it tells you, who was there, who gave all the remarks, transcripts of everyone's speeches. So it's a really great thing to have. So we know that Noah Miller, the president of the association, presided over the whole thing. This is Noah on the far left of that photograph, also study group member. And so they opened this dedication with a period of meditation led by Florence Edmonds, seen here, a picture of Gladys, a few years later, around 1947. And so Florence led everyone in meditation, and then Noah gave some opening remarks. He says that this is a happy occasion for all of us. We have gathered here this afternoon to dedicate the new library, offices, and record vault of the Association of Research and Enlightenment, and doing so paying tribute to Edgar Cayce. And it's really interesting that they did a very brief ceremony as part of the dedication. Noah says that we've come to this point in our program where we are to dedicate the vault, which contained the records of the association. So what they did is they took a collection of readings. One was the first reading in the whole collection, the earliest reading that they had from 1911. They also had a reading, one of the work readings as well. And then they had the most recent reading that they had done just the day before. So they symbolically presented all of those to Gladys, and she went and placed them in the new vault. Now we have a picture of this original archival storage here. This is May St. Clair. And all of the readings are in that bank of file cabinets, and there are file cabinets on the other side of the room as well. And all of those binders that you see there are all the original extracts and research reports that they had been doing all the way up until this point. So we see here, that's the first stage of this research program that they were creating. May St. Clair would actually head the readings research department later on. And we know after we had that symbolic presentation of the readings, Thomas Segru, Edgar Cayce's biographer, gave some remarks. He gave 10 pages of speech, a very eloquent speech talking about, the purpose of this dedication and the future work of the association that they were all working together to move forward with. And so after Tom was done, Edgar Cayce came out and gave the closing remarks. And he said, "There's only one thing I want to say, that is to thank you." And he shared an interesting story as well. So Edgar was saying one of the carpenters that was actually working on this new edition, he said, "Well, Mr. Cayce, I've heard about you. I've heard a lot of people say a lot of things about you, but I don't think I've ever met a man just like you. I don't know what it is that's different, but there's something." And Edgar noted that when all the construction was finished, that carpenter actually came back, and the first set of books to be put in the new library was donated by this man as well. So we knew that they were having more of an impact in the community than they thought they were. And so, Edgar ended the dedication with a word of prayer, and they got on with the work that they needed to do. And so, we've got lovely photographs of the day itself, everyone that was present, and also the publications that, came out of that. This is from 1948, one of the, first brochures of that era, where the A.R.E. is located, the address and everything, and a description of all the different kinds of research that one could do at Arctic Crescent. And so this starts really the beginning of the huge effort to make the readings more accessible and to jumpstart new research projects in the late 1940s. And so I would love to answer any questions that you have. So feel free to put them down in the comments. I'll take a look here. Yes, Melody, they are fireproof. One of the first projects that I worked on when I came to be the archivist at ECF is we put in a fire suppression system, which archives, all of the world do. So there's a special gas that is that can be deployed through nozzles, and it doesn't hurt paper. So it's so much better than having, your traditional sprinkler system. So if there were to be a fire in the archive, it would be taken care of 10 seconds or less, and there would be no damage to the material. We also put in shelving units as well, that they're in these bays, and they're all enclosed as well, so we have another added layer of protection. We do have some research projects going right now. Thomas, I'm working with Dr. Davis out of Hampton University, who's writing a new biography on Edgar Cayce that's going to be published by University Press, so that's really exciting for us. Our reading room is closed at the moment. We haven't opened up quite yet, but I'm doing any sort of research request remotely and using all our digital capabilities. So that's been great to be able to keep in touch with researchers and be able to help people online. I've seen a question, have you ever come across readings that were lost? I've actually found 2 readings in the archive while I've been here that we didn't know we had. One was with some of the records from Edgar Cayce's oil venture days from the early 1920s. They're kind of stuck together with some correspondence. And then I actually found another reading that was in one of Shealy and Cayce's boxes as well, one of the unprocessed collections that are now processed. So that was, very exciting to find, and we were able to add them and properly catalog them in the collection. Let's see here. Is there any other questions anyone has? We've got a question, are all the readings on the CD-ROM? We're actually, instead of updating the CD-ROM, all of the readings database material is online in the member section on edgarcayce.org. And I also help to administer that section as well. So everything is now fully updated. All those readings that I found are transcribed with their any other material, and so they're able to be searched through that database. So everything is up to date now. Well, thank you all so much for joining me this week. I'll be bringing you more exciting material from the archives throughout the decades in the coming weeks. If you have any questions for me at all, either comments or feel free to send me an email. You'll be able to find contact info for the archive on edgarcaycefoundation.org, as well as seeing all of the progress on the inventory that we've been doing since 2018. So we're in the planning stages on all our digital offerings, but right now you can actually go in our catalog and be able to see everything that is in the archive that has been inventoried up to this point. So you get a better idea of the really variety and wealth of collections that we have in the archive. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next time.
Okay, and we're recording. Excellent. You look fantastic. Okay, first question is, how did you find out about Edgar Cayce's A.R.E. and the Cayce work?
In 1972, I was invited to attend a meeting in San Francisco, which was of the Academy of Parapsychology and Medicine. And there I met Bill and Gladys McGarry. And they said, you need to meet Bob Brewer. He's a physician who thinks like you. So I called Bob Brewer, who was in Maryland at the time, and he was organizing a meeting at the last weekend in August into the first week of September. And I attended that. It was called A Week of Attunement. And it literally blew my mind. The first morning, I learned about autogenic training, biofeedback, and I heard that there was going to be a past life therapy session, not on the program. It was sort of in the afternoon. We would go to the spa or the beach or whatever. Well, I attended the past life therapy session, and that really blew my mind. I thought, oh my heavens, I've got to have one of those. But I wouldn't do it in front of other people. I mean, maybe I was a prostitute in a Greek war camp. Where they came from, I don't know. It's never come up in a previous, subsequent past life suspicion. But I asked to have a private session, and I did. And I saw myself as a physician in Egypt 1,000 years ago in a cholera epidemic. My wife in that life was a girlfriend from my current life. My son in that life was a close friend in my current life. And we settled the cholera epidemic by burning all the bodies. I spent the next 3 hours in a total bliss state, just staring at the sky and walking on the beach. That evening, Joel Andrews was giving a harp concert. Now, I had never heard a harp live in my, before. But I'm sitting there with, I think there were 212 people at the meeting. And all of a sudden, I'm on the ceiling. I had an out-of-body experience looking at the audience below. And well, isn't that interesting? What's going on here? And I can say that although I've always been what I would call moderately intuitive, that weekend of that whole week that I spent there really opened my intuitive interest and ability. And I, of course, was immediately interested in psychic diagnosis. I mean, that's what people were talking about with Edgar Cayce. And so I got to meet somebody like that. Well, I met Genevieve Haller, the psychiatrist, the chiropractor who was very active in A.R.E. at that time as well, a good friend of mine for years. And she suggested, well, why don't you meet Henry Rucker? He is in Chicago, and he's one of the people we know who's very good. So on December 19th, I visited Henry Rucker, and I walked into his office, and he said, I've been waiting 10 years for you. My teacher told me you would come. Henry knew more about me than I did. He was a Black psychic from the ghetto of Chicago, had a metaphysical church that was called something like the Holy Essence of Hermetic Wisdom. So I invited Henry to come up to my clinic, which was in La Crosse, Wisconsin at the time, to see if he could make a diagnosis of patients. I had 24 patients in the hospital that I was working with. Henry, without knowing anything about the patient but their name and seeing them, was 75% accurate in making a diagnosis. We walked down the hall in front of several offices, one of them several patient rooms, and he said, he doesn't have leukemia. That's what I thought he had, but because his white blood count had suddenly jumped up to 41,000 after surgical operation. He doesn't have leukemia. He just has a liver problem. You bet I hear next week. And he was right. So Henry turned out to be not just a good intuitive reader, a medical intuitive reader, later called it, but actually the best one-on-one counselor I've ever known in my life. An hour with Henry was worth 50 years with the average psychologist. I mean, for instance, our minister at the Congregational Church had a son who was locked up in some kind of facility because of drug addiction. And he wanted to consult with Henry, and Henry said, oh, don't worry about him. He'll be home soon. The next day, the son had escaped from the facility and was on his way home. And so they took him down to Chicago to see Henry. Henry spent an hour with him. He walked out and said, why didn't everybody talk to me like that? And he has never been on drugs since then. So Henry became a counselor at my pain clinic. I was working in those days, I was working with people for 3 to 4 weeks at a time to try to get them out of very chronic, disabled stuff. Henry would spend 1 hour with every patient, and he was just an integral part of our entire experience. It was just a wonderful time. And because I was on the faculty on the staff at that time at a Catholic hospital, I thought, we can't really have the holy essence of Hermetic wisdom. So Henry and I founded the Science of Mind Church of Chicago. The Science of Mind Church, of course, is one of the New Thought movements that started with Unity, et cetera, back at the end of the 19th century. But ever since that episode at the A.R.E. in the fall, and then with Henry, I would say my intuition has been extremely better, or a lot more active. I had already come up with dorsal column stimulation and with transcutaneous electrostimulation stimulation of TENS, but I suddenly wanted to get a PhD in psychology. So I went back to the Institute of Humanistic Psychology, which is now Saybrook University, and got my PhD in psychology and developed something I call biogenics. Biogenics is a series of 68 different mental self-regulation, meditative type exercises, which I consider better than all psychology in the world. And I have used it in all kinds of research on it. Shortly after that I also developed cranial electrical stimulation for depression and anxiety, and then began to call it holistic medicine. It was really, I think, the week in Virginia Beach at the A.R.E. that spawned my idea in the broader sense of holism as a spiritual thing rather than just an alternative to conventional medicine. So here we are, a few years later, and I am, well, still going at it.
Perfect. Norm, that is extraordinary. And I must say, it is so hard not to talk and interject while you're, talking. So if you see me nodding, I'm following along. It just makes it easier for Kevin to do his editing, but phenomenal, your history. Okay, our second question is, how did the readings at the A.R.E. perhaps change your life? Which you may have kind of already answered, but.
Well, of course, it gave me the broad feel of holism. Cayce talked roughly about almost everything. He used he used radiac device. He developed all kinds of other things. His lectures on nutrition got me interested in that. His concept that 80% of your diet should be alkaline, all got things. And of course, my favorite of all these years, castor oil. I had, at that time, that winter, we had a horse who got its ankle cut badly in wire, and the vet wanted to put him down. We took Pampers and soaked him with castor oil and taped him on the ankle and the calf, and the horse got well. And of course, castor oil packs on the abdomen. Eventually, I developed a castor oil bath where you actually put a cup of castor oil and soak in the bathtub, or on your whole body and after the bath, and put on a sweatsuit. I call it a castor oil suit to sleep in it. And of course, castor oil in the eyes to prevent cataracts. I've got hundreds of people who've cured their cataracts with that. So I would say I've consulted the Cayce readings more or less continuously all these years.
Fantastic. Another question, this is interesting. What do you think was Edgar Cayce's most important advice?
I would say it was really, in many, many ways, he discussed this over and over again. He didn't always call it this, but basically, his advice was, you are to live the golden rule. If you want to be okay, you treat other people well, et cetera, et cetera.
So very true. And then this is just a fun one to end it. Did you ever try sleeping on a book to learn its contents the way that little Edgar did?
No, I know that is supposed to work. I'm aware that it happens, but I sleep so soundly and I have so much dreaming. I don't think my mind has time to read the book.
I think that is so wonderful. Norm, thank you so much. It is just such a joy always talking with you and hearing from you and all of the contributions that you've made at the A.R.E. and your lectures and your extraordinary devotion to this work and how you integrate it into your practice. Just such an honor to work with you and to be able to interview you.
Well, and indeed, as I said, I believe the ARE is the finest foundation in the world.
You are something else. Thank you so much. Well, we think the same of you. And thank you for your time today. And we will be back in touch soon. We'll look forward to working with you again. And I hope that you're doing well during this time.
The Cayce readings on spiritual growth have served as a guide for decades, enabling people from every religious background to become more aware of themselves and their relationship to one another. Small interdenominational study groups exist worldwide, exploring the readings' approach to cooperation, service, love, meditation, and prayer. From Cayce's perspective, part of our purpose here on earth is to come to know our true relationship with God, and perhaps more than anything else, meditation is the key to understanding that relationship.
Sitting quietly each day for a few minutes and awakening this divine within, I heard about all my life and had a heck of a time getting myself to the point of trying it on a consistent, persistent basis. But once I began to do that, I think there really can come a sense of, yes, there's more to us than a physical body.
We especially try to help people work with what I call the keys to healing, which are the ideal, prayer, meditation, application.
As we journey through life on the spiritual path, working with meditation and prayer, the natural outcome, according to Cayce, is that we will enter into this oneness of consciousness.
I think that the philosophy in the Cayce material, for me as for a lot of other people, is what has put together a lot of the loose ends of my understanding of who I am, what life is all about, what my relationship with God is, and that is a lifelong work.
There is that perfect pattern within each one of us. You know, the soul made in the image of God, therefore there has to be some part of us that's perfect. We don't generally see that, but at least that potential is there. And how does that manifest? How can we enhance that? What can we do at every level to live in the earth in a more constructive, helpful, hopeful, loving way?
Most often, Cayce used the language of traditional Christianity. However, the ideas in the readings are deeply ecumenical, so that the pattern of Jesus' life is presented as a pattern for every soul in the earth.
Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, thy neighbor as thyself. This the whole law. This the whole answer to the world, to each and every soul. This is the answer to the world conditions as they exist today. Man's answer to everything has been power. Power of money, power of position, power of wealth, power of this, that, or the other. This has never been God's way. Will never be God's way. Rather, little by little, line upon line, here a little, there a little, each thinking rather of the other. Make the world a better place, because you have lived in it.
When the Association for Research and Enlightenment was formed in 1931, the purpose was to research and make available practical insights from Cayce's psychic readings. Today, the A.R.E. community has grown to tens of thousands of members around the world, regional offices, and programs that include international outreach, conferences, and educational activities. A graduate degree program is available through Atlantic University, and the Harold J. Riley School of Massotherapy trains in concepts of massage and holism found in the Cayce readings. Even now, the purpose of these ever-growing organizations is to allow individuals the opportunity to research the Cayce information for themselves, letting them discover ways in which this material can be practically applied in daily life.
The specific information in the Edgar Cayce readings that was given years ago for thousands of people is just as relevant today.
I think the beating heart of the A.R.E. would be people who are committed to doing the best job they can do of living their ideals and purposes.
Our goal is not to escape the earth. It's not to get out of the physical. It's not to wait just for heaven and then everything will be all right. The goal from the Cayce perspective is that we need to bring heaven into the earth. That the very best we can think of, our goal is to bring it here, because we are children of the divine, and that we came to the earth for a reason. And that reason really is to manifest the spirituality of the God into the earth.
When I try to think what this work might be like decades and decades from now, I imagine that Edgar Cayce's readings will be readily available and accessible in a wide variety of ways throughout the world. But at the same time, my hope is that the ideas in those readings will have inspired creative endeavors and new initiatives and new ways of doing the kinds of things Edgar Cayce did well into the 21st century and beyond.
Much of the information given hasn't even been tapped yet.
Who will help me most? And he says, God. What word?
Members of the A.R.E. come from all walks of life and spiritual traditions. Perhaps these words of Edgar Cayce best describe the ongoing work of the association.
Neither I nor the association that carries on the work with the readings has anything to sell, nor has any instant answers. What we do have is a body of information. Of this information, I can only say that in my life, and in the lives of many of those who have come in contact with the readings, there seems to be much that is a help. If this knowledge is to be of any lasting benefit to mankind, it will require open-minded, intelligent research by men and women in all walks of life, engaged in a cooperative effort. There are no barriers to prevent any individual from taking part in the association.
The legacy of this kind and gentle man lives on today in the extraordinary work that he left behind, and in the people who keep his dream alive through the Association for Research and Enlightenment. It is an association of people, built upon the information contained in the Edgar Cayce readings. Information that has touched the lives of millions. Information that has proven valuable for nearly a century. Information that explores our relationship with God, one another, and ourselves. As individuals grasp the concepts in the Edgar Cayce readings, they can transform themselves and in turn transform society.
All knowledge is to be used in the manner that will give help and assistance to others. And the desire is that the laws of the Creator be manifested in the physical world.
Although Cayce died more than 75 years ago, the timeliness of the material in the readings, with subjects like discovering your mission in life, developing your intuition, exploring ancient mysteries, and taking responsibility for your health, is evidenced by the hundreds of books that have been written on the various aspects of this work, as well as the dozen or so titles focusing on Cayce's life itself. These books contain information so valuable that even Edgar Cayce himself might have hesitated to predict their impact on the contemporary world. In 1945, the year of his passing, who could have known that terms such as meditation, spiritual growth, auras, soulmates, and holistic health would become mainstream?
Okay, we're recording. He'll edit all of this stuff out. So thank you again for joining us today to help us honor and celebrate 90th anniversary of the A.R.E. And you are just one of our premier speakers here. And so you've spent a lot of time devoting your time. And we'd love to know and find out about, you know, how did you find out about the Edgar Cayce work, and, you know, how did this really maybe impact you or change your life?
Well, my first knowledge of the Edgar Cayce work was actually back probably in the early 2000s or even late 1990s. I had a very good friend, Judson Newbern, who had grown up in Ahoskie, North Carolina. And he and I would have fascinating conversations about all manner of things. But it turns out that his grandmother had had a reading with Edgar Cayce. And Judson and I took a road trip up to Virginia Beach one time to kind of investigate that record. And that was my first knowledge of this. And it was astonishing to me, kind of the nature of what had happened with all of these readings. And but I must say, back then, you know, I was working as a conventionally trained neurosurgeon, brought up in the conventional models of modern science, and I had no idea how to make sense of all this. So that first encounter through Judson Newbern's grandmother's reading was important to get me initiated, but it really took my own near-death experience in 2008 to really open my mind widely to the work of Edgar Cayce and what all he had been doing back in the day with this incredible wealth of kind of empirical data of his investigations into people's lives and into the broader kind of spiritual aspects of their lives. And so I've really appreciated the opportunities I've had to present at the A.R.E. Had some beautiful audiences down there, very engaged people. So for me, you know, it's just a tremendous gift to the world that Edgar Cayce had these capabilities and shared them so broadly.
That's wonderful. It's always so interesting, you know, to hear the background. What do you think was Cayce's most important advice?
Well, I think probably the most important advice really had to do with kind of our responsibility for choices. You know, there are many aspects of modern civilization that would allow us to hide and pretend we're not responsible agents for our choices in everything we do in our dealings with self and others. And yet Cayce's work showed very clearly that our choices matter and the way we live our lives matter. And so I would say that was one of his most important lessons, because in our modern, very kind of polarized and confused society, we've especially lost track of some of the kind of guiding stars like Cayce presented about, you know, the sense of responsibility, connectedness, and love that binds us all. So I hope that those are really the enduring lessons of his teaching that were badly needed in the past, and probably even more so needed in this current era as we awaken to the deeper truths about the nature of human existence. But much of it can greatly benefit from wisdom about Edgar Cayce's teachings.
So true. So very true. That's spot on. And then a final fun question. Did you ever try sleeping on a book to learn its contents the way that little Edgar did?
Well, what I've done is I've slept with a book at my bedside table with that knowledge of how he was able to accomplish that. Maybe I need to put it under my pillow. Maybe that's the important step that I've kind of missed so far. But I think there are many ways of going within to gain tremendous knowledge. So it's not just about putting a book under a pillow, but exploring the realms of mind. And that's where Cayce really showed us the way. He had extraordinary abilities and he shared so much with the world. And those are the kind of lessons we need to take to heart.
That is absolutely perfect.